We just ask people what do they self-identify as, whether they see themselves as Muslim. And again, anyone who calls himself a Muslim, for us, he's part of the Ummah, part of Muslim public opinion.
Some more cynical people will say that really there is no Ummah in a practical sense, with the meaning that someone in Morocco and someone in Indonesia, as far as they are, they actually have no shared material interests, and that being the case, their self-ascription to a common Ummah might mean something religiously, but in practical terms, in political terms, which is what you study, it's not irrelevant. What would you say to that?
I love the idea of Sharia, and I love the idea of ruling by the law of Allah. And when I think of that, I'm not thinking like a non-Muslim Texan or something like that who has a lot of fear in his mind of what that entails. I'm thinking of like Umar ibn al-Khattab. I'm thinking of like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. I'm thinking of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Uthman, and Ali radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, again for joining us for our second episode of Muntaha Majalis. I'm joined once again with my co-host, Junaid. A little bit about Junaid. I think last time he was only here for a short amount of time. Alhamdulillah, he did his political science degree at McGill University, which is one of the most reputable universities that we have in Canada. And then he continued. He was in Egypt at the American University, and he did his master's in Islamic studies. And then, alhamdulillah, now he's pursuing his PhD at the University of Toronto. We're going to speak today with Dr. Mujtaba Isani. We're really, really honored to be joined by Dr. Mujtaba today. The background that he comes from, his expertise, is that he's a political scientist. His work focuses on one of the most important and one of the most misunderstood questions of our time, like how Muslims actually view themselves when they think about politics and governance and legitimacy within global power and the international order. Dr. Mujtaba, he is a DAAD. This is something in German. I looked it up. I can't pronounce it, and I don't want to embarrass myself. He is the DAAD Professor of Political Science at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, and he completed his PhD at the University of Munster with earlier graduate training at Ohio State University and Marquette University. It was at Ohio State, in fact, a long, long time ago, that I was blessed with the company of Dr. Mujtaba. And, I don't remember many of the early discussions we had, but I do remember that I was quite taken aback with his research and his expertise and, the world and the viewpoints that he offered at that time. And alhamdulillah, I was blessed to continue maintaining contact with him throughout. He's also done a lot of research at other institutes, including Oxford, Michigan, Syracuse, Houston, and so on. He has taught and conducted research everywhere, really, honestly. He's been in Europe, he's been in the Gulf, he's been in South Asia, and his work, it sits right at the intersection of geopolitics, public opinion, political Islam, international legitimacy, and so on. He's the author of a very important book, Muslim Public Opinion Towards the International Order. I suggest everybody should get their hands on this if they're able to. It's a study that examines how Muslim societies view institutions such as the UN, regional organizations, and even the idea of the Khilafah, the Caliphate, as a political model. His research has appeared in a lot of journals, Political Research Quarterly, International Political Science Review, European Union Politics, the American Journal of Islam and Society, and he's explored a range of topics throughout all of these journals through a bunch of articles that he's written. And inshallah, we're going to go through a lot of that today. Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh, for joining us. We really appreciate you giving your time to us.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much for such a kind introduction and such an extensive introduction. And I look forward to this podcast.
Alhamdulillah, jazakumullah khair. As I mean, it might sound extensive, but your academic pedigree and research is even more than that. I had to cut out a number of things from there. But I want to start off with that, like just a little bit about your pre-academic background. Where did you grow up? What inspired you to study political science? You know, why did you want to survey Muslims globally on issues related to politics and jihad and governance and the likes thereof?
So actually, I grew up in Karachi, and I did my high school in Karachi, and then I moved to the US for my undergraduate. Did my undergraduate degree at a liberal arts college called Illinois Wesleyan. That's because I got a full ride to do my undergraduate work there, and I majored in political science and economics. After that, I actually spent some time in Germany learning the German language. Um, After which I wasn't really sure. I worked in a think tank for a bit, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue working at the think tank. So I wanted to see if academia fit me better. And so I began a master's in international affairs at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as some of you may know, it's a Jesuit school. Actually, I was fortunate to have wonderful discussions with Jesuit priests that I made friends with there and other members of the Jesuit order, which of course exposed me to a lot of Catholic liberal theology as well there. But that was a wonderful experience. After which I began my PhD at Ohio State, where Sheikh I met you as well. And I was a PhD candidate there, but I ended up finishing up at the University of Munster, where I was a research fellow at the Religion and Politics Excellence Cluster on a project that examined Muslim public opinion towards international actors and international organizations. So I was very fortunate again that we had funding to conduct surveys across the Muslim world. And as a graduate student, we conducted surveys through that project in Jordan, in Egypt, in Pakistan. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. So I think that's what shaped sort of my academic career, working a lot on attitudes and public opinion, especially in the Muslim world. And of course, once I was in this, there are a lot of intricacies and complexities in surveying people in the Muslim world, and I was fortunate to get a very good training and very good experience in doing so. I can also continue
Alhamdulillah.
after that if you want me. So
Yeah.
I think after I finished at Munster, I did a postdoc at the University of Munster. Um, and then I wanted to move back to Pakistan, so I was an assistant professor at Habib University in Karachi for a year. After that, I was an assistant professor at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. That was also a wonderful experience in that I was able to understand Saudi society quite well, but also the ways the Saudi leadership thinks as well, because uh, again, we were told what to teach, and I think that also sort of made me understand how sort of the leadership in Saudi Arabia also thinks. And we were, so I think at King Fahd University, it was the only place that taught political science at university in English in all of Saudi Arabia. So that was also quite a distinct sort of place to be at. And then after Saudi Arabia, I
Yeah.
went back to Germany. I was a research fellow at the University of Mannheim. I became a guest professor at the University of Munster. Then I moved to Berlin, where I was leading a panel at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, and the panel focused on serving people of migration background, but also other German residents. And then we had to, of course, provide suggestions and policy proposals, especially to the German Family Ministry that sponsored this think tank, on how to uh, mitigate or how to better the conditions of people from migration background in terms of their racism and discrimination experiences. And after that, I moved to Pakistan for this position, which is the German Academic Exchange Service. If you translate that into English, the German Academic Exchange Service sort of sponsored professorship at Qaeda Azam University. So I'm here currently doing that.
That's awesome, alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, just
Yeah.
about Germany. Just to start off with, like, you said that you wanted to learn the German language and you moved to Germany to do your like early studies there as well after being at Wesleyan. What was the reason that you wanted to shift over there, and like what was your experience in Germany of the Muslim community compared to that between that and the U.S.? That's a personal question.
Yes, so actually, so my wife is German and we got married in the US. So, of course, that was one of the main motivations for me to move to Germany. And when I moved there, I think I did a good thing by beginning my sort of journey in Germany by learning the German language, because I think that really helped me as I um, began a career in Germany, for which I think the German language is quite important. And if you don't have a
Sure.
good expertise in the language, you're likely not to succeed that well in Germany. And I think that's what the data also suggests. So that was one of my main motivations. But then again, afterwards, I got a very good research fellowship in Germany. I had a very good supervisor there at the University of Munster. So it all worked out quite well. In terms of the difference between the Muslim community in Germany and the Muslim community in the US, actually, I will probably take a little bit of time here, but I think when I moved to the US, I went to a small liberal arts college, as I said, in central Illinois, in the middle of nowhere. And I began, I quickly became the president of the Muslim Student Association there, because there's just a few Muslims
Inshallah.
in my university. Although there was another university close by, which was the Illinois State University, they had more Muslims, so both the MSAs collaborated a lot. And actually, the community in that small town of Bloomington, Illinois, at that time was very, very wonderful. And there were two mosques only. A bit of a difference. There was one sort of more Salafi focused mosque and one sort of Pakistani Sufi leaning mosque. But I think it was wonderful that I was able to bring the mosques together as well. I think I remember during my first year,
MashaAllah.
I sort of organized the Eid prayers together. They had never prayed Eid prayers together, but I was able to organize the Eid prayer on campus for both the mosques, and we had wonderful. We had the whole community on campus. And so my first experience with the Muslim community in the US was absolutely wonderful, actually. Anyone knew that was coming in, we were welcoming them. We did a lot of dawah in Bloomington, Illinois. Of course, some of our African American brothers there worked a lot with prisoners. And then, of course, my wife as well. She also was a convert. And she converted as well, and other people just from the MSI activities also converted. So it's a very fulfilling experience initially in the US. And then, of course, Milwaukee was a bigger town when I moved there. It had more diversity in the people that they were. And then we were together at Ohio State, and I think that was also a wonderful experience, I think, for me and for others,
Absolutely.
especially with the MSA. And although one thing that was, the community was really good of the MSA brothers, if you, as you remember, there were some sort of, sometimes some sort of disagreements as to how to proceed in the best way. But I think because we were so close together, I think we managed it, and it was a good experience. In Germany, I think one thing that was different from the US that you might know is that a lot of the Muslim community is arranged according to nationality. So there are the Turkish mosques, the Arabic mosques, the Pakistani mosques, And this was less so in sort of Bloomington, Illinois, where there was only one mosque, and then or a couple of mosques, and then in other places in the U.S. as well. So I think this was more nationality focused. But the mosque that I started to going in Berlin, where my wife is from, was also an old mosque, a wonderful mosque. It's called Bilal Masjid, Bilal Moshe, as it's called. It still exists there. Also wonderful people, but I think the big difference was this sort of nationality focused versus, I think, a more diverse crowd in the mosques in the US.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. I think let's dive into some of Professor's writings. Your book, Muslim Public Opinion and the Opinion Towards the International Order. For those who haven't read the book, what would you say is the core puzzle you're trying to get at in this book? And what will we find in this kind of book that hasn't been in the literature before? What are we hearing about Muslim perspectives?
So, one thing is that the book focuses on Muslim attitudes. So, again, as we all know, Muslims are not monolithic in nature. So, Egyptian Muslims would be much different from Pakistani Muslims. But I think one of the things that the book tries to do is to generalize and see what are the commonalities in the formation of public opinion towards international actors. I think some of the puzzles that I began with, one of which was why do Muslims see, like there was already some survey data from the Pew Global Attitudes, from the World Values Survey, that showed that Muslims were, relatively speaking, more negative towards international organizations than other religions. And so that was one of the puzzles that I began with. And then again, there was this question of how do Muslims formulate their opinion towards international actors, international organizations. So I think those were the two basic puzzles that I began with. Yes. Should I go into the findings or?
Um, yeah, sure. Why don't you tell us? I mean, I guess if I had a question that probably is in the findings, it would be that when you say that Muslims are more skeptical towards these international organizations, the UN, and so on, but do they reject or are they skeptical of these things on a fundamental level and that they do not see them as legitimate whatsoever? Or is it more so that they have criticisms that these organizations are biased or apply their rules selectively in a negative way, a negative biased way against Muslims?
So that's a very good question. I think so. There could be many factors that shape uh, Muslim public opinion towards international actors like the UN. So one of which is also looked at in the literature is sort of these anti-West, whether it is because of anti-West attitudes that they have anti-UN attitudes. And this is again debated whether this is so. But one thing that I really found strongly in the data is that Muslims' opinion of the UN was shaped by their view of the US. And the U used a sort of US opinion as a heuristic to determine their UN opinion because the US is a more prominent actor in the Muslim world than the UN. So a lot of people in the Middle East know the US much better than the UN. We also found out that Muslims overall saw the UN at that time as US controlled. Maybe currently there's a slight difference in how that is seen, but at that time for sure they saw the UN as US controlled, and maybe this was sort of their anti Americanism shifting into their anti UN attitudes. I think that was one big finding in the UN chapter.
Fascinating. I mean, just a brief spin-off. I don't want us to get too sidetracked, but as you alluded to, the situation might be a little different today because the United States has adopted some policies and a sort of attitude towards the UN itself, where the U.S. is going counter to a lot of UN resolutions. They're kind of at odds with the quote unquote international community. I wonder would that affect Muslims' perceptions of the UN today in very recent times.
Yeah, I think it depends on how salient this is, in the sense that how much do people in the Muslim world know about this as well. I think because that's a big thing. But I think at that time, especially because the US was the highest donor to the UN. It was also known such that, and I think another thing, I'm going to more sort of detail into how they formulate their attitudes. I think we also found out that in terms of sort of security related stuff, the UN was viewed as more negatively than in sort of humanitarian assistance. And when you ask the UN in terms of sort of humanitarian assistance and UNESCO or their sort of cultural work, they were looked at more positively when you talked about the UN Security Council. And I think much of that would stay even today. Although I think now maybe in some sectors or in some places, the UN is not seen as much as US influence, but of course the US influence still is quite much there in the UN. And of course, in other organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, the US influence is much more, but of course, there is also much of US influence in the UN as well.
Yeah, I think for my own travels, like a couple of I was in Bosnia and I was in even in India as well. I think Muslims have this perception that the UN, it's either just following in tow with whatever U.S. foreign policy is, or when it is against U.S. foreign policy, there's always this kind of like belief that it's a castrated institution that's not really there to serve any other purpose. And in very much that way, I mean, there's a lot of contentions where they speak about why are we adopting ideas of human rights? Why are we adopting ideas of anything that's kind of like shaped by the UN conventions that the early conventions that took place, because they say, okay, we're not really represented by this. When the things that happened in Bosnia, when they took place in Srebrenica and in Sarajevo and different places, where were they serving our cause? Where were they, originally when it was established? We didn't have representation the right way. So there's a lot of like contentions amongst like even the educated Muslim, thinkers, but also amongst the lay people. That's kind of like filtered down. I want to ask like two questions tied to
Can
this
I
experience that
give
I
a
had.
sort of Can I
Yeah,
sort of add something to this? So this is an
of
example
course.
that I give to my students a lot in class. I've been teaching about sort of UN international actors in Pakistan as well, and of course I've also been to Bosnia and worked with researchers there, and I think they view Pakistan quite positively in terms of what
Mm,
happened during the civil war there. And one of the reasons was, so you know that during the Srebrenica massacre, there were UN peacekeepers stationed there.
yeah.
And these were mainly Dutch UN peacekeepers. And when the massacre occurred, they didn't do much because they reasoned
Mhm.
that, of course, their mandate didn't allow them to take part in this war directly. And I was talking to other people there, and they said that the Pakistani UN peacekeepers, actually, because of their sort of sense of brotherhood and the sense of sort of protecting the Bosnians, they actively took part in protecting the Bosnians more than the other UN peacekeepers. So it's interesting how, again, within sort of this UN peacekeeping and within the UN, you can find some sort of variation in how UN peacekeepers act, and that brought Pakistan a lot of goodwill and good faith in Bosnia, especially
Yeah.
their actions during the civil war.
You're you're reminding me of something, Professor. At the University of Toronto, we had an event. A professor came to speak from McMaster University in Canada. His name's Basit Iqbal. He wrote this book on the Syrian civil war. And one thing he writes about in that is there's this perception among Syrians and Arabs, people in the Middle East generally, that these often UN, international NGOs, charitable humanitarian organizations that are specifically not Muslim, they are not willing to break any rules to serve people in need. So, for example, the example he uses is that all of these humanitarian organizations based in Jordan that you might expect to help people suffering in Syria, they wouldn't do it because they have some mandate that they can't cross that border. That's against their rules. Meanwhile, specifically Muslim organizations, charitable organizations often funded by rich people from the Gulf, they don't care. They find a way, one way or another, to get aid across the border to help Syrians. They don't care what the rules are. They just think we need to help our Muslim brothers in Syria. And so there's a perception among local people that these organizations are more sincere, they're more real, they actually care about accomplishing their goal. And so they kind of have a higher legitimacy in the eyes of, local Syrians and other Arabs than these international, which we might say is kind of meaning, Western backed, Western funded and supported organizations, which I think has some parallel with your own work.
So I was also, so this is very contemporary. And Qaeda Azam University is also where we have a lot of discussion. The department is very, in terms of Pakistani political science academia, it's probably one of the best departments in Pakistan. And we were talking about the current Gaza crises. And of course, there was this idea of sending a peace mission composed of Muslim countries going to Gaza. And one of the discussions that we were having was that
Yeah.
once, like, Pakistan, if they allow Pakistani and Indonesian soldiers to go there, but especially if they allow Pakistani soldiers to go there, maybe the suffering is such that the Pakistani soldiers might not be able to resist protecting the people of Gaza, and maybe things changed then. So it was interesting, and then of course there was some opposition of sending Pakistani troops to Gaza, but the light that many people were seeing was that maybe when once they are there and they see the suffering, that they are obliged to intervene as they did, for example, as I told you, in Bosnia.
Yeah. SubhanAllah.
Yeah, like I think that's a very legitimate fear from those who wouldn't want something like that to happen. And it's why I think during those negotiations, Israel really didn't want peacekeepers from Muslim countries in there, but especially the negotiations, that they got that through. Sorry, Muzamil,
No,
go
I
ahead.
mean, my question was tied to this, and I think it's kind of answered itself in a certain capacity, which was like related more so to, okay, you're studying the Ummah, and so the viewpoints of the Ummah. But it's really just important to define like what we mean. Obviously, theologically speaking, when we're speaking from like the Shari'i perspective, we understand what the Ummah is. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He mentions the Ummah in the Quran as well, and some of the attributes and the qualities. But like, how does that play out in the contemporary world that we inhabit? That was my question. It's the ummah still exists, and these are, whether you call it Muslim majority countries or whatever it is, but what impact does it have as it's concurrent with the international world order and with the UN, and with all of these other institutions that that try to set the world in a certain vision?
So actually, if I answer it in a very academic and sort of the way we do surveys, we just ask people what do they self-identify as, whether they see themselves as Muslim, and again, anyone who calls himself a Muslim, for us, he's part of the Ummah, part of Muslim public opinion. So I think in that sort of very quantitative survey sense,
Okay.
we just, whoever calls himself Muslim is a Muslim that we look into.
Okay. And that's not, I mean, you don't go into the further divisions of like Sunni Shia relations and all of this. Like anybody who it says I'm Muslim, identifies as a Muslim, then they are, their viewpoint like counts.
So no, within the analysis, especially, of course, we do separate the sects and see whether they have differing opinions about international actors. So of course, the Shia and the Sunni, and of course, the usual questions are, of course, the Shias would be more favorable towards Iran, and the Sunnis would be more favorable towards more Sunni countries. But we do, whenever we're asking these questions, we do make a difference. We do ask for
Hmm.
the sects and see what are the sort of uh,
Okay.
the trends in their public opinion. But generally, when we're doing sort of public opinion research, we're doing broad general research and trying to come up with generalizable findings. And so, yes, we do ask these questions and do a different analysis, but probably not as profound as you would like it to be.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to I didn't I wanted to hold off the Iran questions until a little bit later, but something just like comes to mind at the moment, because we opened this bottle. Like, when the 1979 revolution happens and Khomeini comes into power, you find that a lot of Sunnis, I mean, my father included, and many of the Jamaat Islami members in South Asia, they see this in a very positive way. Sunnis, I mean, in many countries, see this in a very positive light. Their celebrations and so on. Of course, over time, the direction that the Iranian government takes and some of its policies really, create a fissure between Sunnis and Shias, especially in the Arab world, and we know everything, and we'll speak about that a little bit more. But do you think, okay, if there is a distrust of the US and of the UN as an extension, and the EU and so on, as we'll speak about, among the Ummah, where do they place their authority when that happens in 1979? People are looking at the Iranian government in a very positive way. At certain points, the Pakistani government, or Saudi under King Fahd, and then there's also, like, Jamaat al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, you have Jamaat Islami, like we just mentioned, you have the Tablighi Jamaat, you have all of these like Muslim institutions, organic Muslim institutions coming from different, scholars and thinkers, and think tanks and so on. Where do Muslims put their authority, and is this just fluid? Is this changing based on like political events and so on?
Okay, so I think this is a difficult question, but I can again talk in general terms. So I think you're right that after the Iranian Revolution, so Khomeini's ideas, as you both of you might well know, he takes a lot of ideas from Maududi and Qutb as well. So I think his sort of revivalist thought
Yeah.
is borrows a lot from Sunni revivalist thought in the 20th century as well. Of course, he gives it a different shape when he talks about the question of wilaya, but I think it is quite similar in the thinking that Muslim revivalist thinkers had um, in the aftermath of the fall of the Ottoman Khilafah. And so I think,
Yeah.
and when people also appreciated what happened in Iran, especially sort of in the subcontinent, they saw at the great sacrifice that they were ready to make to change or to incur the revolution, as in the bravery they showed in sort of standing in front of bullets and not being afraid of being killed. And so that was appreciated a lot. And actually, in the subcontinent, I think there is also a big Shia influence that, again, because we, in Pakistan, for example, um, at least 15 to 20% of the population is Shia. And of course, the Shias and Sunnis have been living together for years, and even sort of in India, a lot of places where even the Pakistani movement began, in Lucknow and Aligarh, a large Shia population. So I think there will always be Shia sympathies in this region, especially. I think this will continue for a long time, just because there's so many Shias here, and of course, Sunni Shias generally have very good relations. Of course, there have been episodes where there have been tensions, but some say that these were sort of also created some of these tensions. In the sense of, I think I would also make a distinction that yeah, it's sometimes Muslim public opinion towards international actors is not sort of constant in sort of where you are determines what your opinion is. I think in the subcontinent, for example, I think there would be more pro Shia sentiment they're in some places in the Gulf. So I think there is that distinction that you should make, that this is not uniform opinion. Um, and so Iran is not viewed uh, as positively in some places of the Muslim world than, for example, in the subcontinent. So it depends on, again, where you're from as well, when you're considering opinion towards international actors. And now, of course, in places like the UAE, I think, although there is no public opinion or attitudinal data in the UAE would be very anti-Iranian right now, for example. That would be much different from other places like Pakistan.
Sure. I think, Professor, you're getting at, you know, a topic that comes up in these discussions of the Ummah or Muslim political revival. Some more cynical people say that really there is no Ummah in a practical sense, with the meaning that someone in Morocco and someone in Indonesia, as far apart as they are, they actually have no shared material interests, and that being the case, their self-ascription to a common Ummah might mean something religiously, but in practical terms, in political terms, which is what you study, it's not relevant. What would you say to that?
So, Alhamdulillah, I've traveled across the Muslim countries to most places in the Muslim world, actually, from Mauritania to Malaysia and everything that comes in between. And so, actually, so I think so.
So you have some authority to speak on this.
And Alhamdulillah, for research purposes and not just for visiting, actually. And so trying to understand these societies
Yeah.
as well. Um, I think so. I think both opinions are sort of wrong in that I think there is a lot that unites the Muslim Ummah as well, and in some cases there is a divergence in opinion on some topics. But I think there's a lot. There's more than what unites the Muslim Ummah. For example, I was in Morocco. I was surprised at what Sheikh Muzammil just mentioned about the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat is a subcontinent-based organization, and they were so popular in Morocco. I was in Mauritania 3 months ago, and the Tablighi Jamaat mosque in Nouakchott is the second biggest mosque there. And this is
Wow.
sort of
Mm.
this is a Pakistani Indian movement that has traveled to Mauritania. So there is more that unites, and of course, you know that they are very Maliki and uh, Tablighi Jamaat. I was actually fascinated to see that, like how. A Tablighi Jamaat mosque, but it is the second biggest mosque in Nouakchott. So I think there's more that unites the Muslim Ummah than what people think in terms of differences. I think so. You will see a lot of similarities in a lot of things and on a lot of topics as well. And I think one thing that I can tell you through hard survey data is that all across the Muslim Ummah, you will see this. Opinion, this desire for Muslim union. I think wherever you ask that you want the Muslim Ummah to be united, the statistics show that everyone is in favor of, not everyone, I shouldn't say that in statistical terms, but a lot of people or a majority
Yeah.
of people in most of
You're
these
speaking
Muslim.
statistically. We understand. Yes.
Yes, in that,
Yeah.
so there's a big desire for unison. There's a big desire of having one ummah as well. And so, although the ummah may be divided on certain topics and certain opinions, I think there is a big desire for unison, and there's more that there's a lot in common, lot in common
Yeah,
among
I
Muslims.
Yeah.
think the
So, okay, go ahead, Islam. But I really want to
No,
ask
no,
something.
okay, yeah. Before you ask the question, I did have like, I mean, just my experience is more anecdotal than it is like research based. But Subhanallah, you feel the Tablighi Jamaat is just one great example. You have in Egypt when I was there, one of the main masajid. I think so. In Egypt, every time one of the Tablighi mosques gains some sort of prominence, then the government comes in, and then they have to shift to another location. So it's constantly like moving around. But when I was in Nasr City. they were asking me questions about India and Indian scholars, and they were asking me about the situation there. When I was in the UK, when I was in even in America, I mean, there is a conscience that exists. And what's very interesting with them is that Tablighi Jamaat, yes, there is like the South Asian component that kind of pervades over the drama and the politics that exists within the institution. So everybody, no matter where you are, they're having those discussions of the schism and all of that. But in many places, the leadership, the local leadership of the Jamaat is, people who are indigenous to that place. Recently, when I was in Austin, we had an ijtima there, and a lot of the ijtima, the people that came from different places, African Americans that were leading their group, and that have been involved with the Jamaat for 40, 50, 60 years, and have established a strong like relationship there, and they feel connected with other members of different ethnicities and nationalities, but through that. And have this idea of an ummah, even when it comes to like political organizations, like for example, Jamaat Islami. You find interestingly like that in South Asia, you have a similar remnant of that in Ikhwan al-Muslimin within the Arab world. Again, like you mentioned, the Iranian concept is derived heavily from some of the early thoughts of Maududi and others, rahimahullah. So there is, among the intellectual Muslim elite, there is still a strong like back and forth. There's dialogue. There's like borrowing from one another. I even remember in Sayyid Qutb, rahimahullah, his Fi Dhilal al-Quran, you have him quoting people like Sheikh Abul Hassan. You have him quoting people like Sheikh Maududi. Allah have mercy on all of them. So it really does go to show that idea that both amongst the Muslim intellectual elite, but also among lay people, this idea of ummah is there, and that desire to have unification of some sort, it does exist there, and that's just anecdotally from the environment that I've been in. And of course, you've done research to that fact. I just wanted to add that, but Junaid, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your praise of the Tablighi Jamaat among other organizations. I want to a quick remark is just that it's really incredible when you mentioned that the Tablighi Jamaat, for example, is big in Mauritania, right? As far away as you can get. When you consider, as anyone who's traveled in the Muslim world, will know, it's often really not easy traveling between these countries. Like it's not like there's a simplified visa regime. I'm not a Pakistani. I've never been to Mauritania, but I can imagine it's probably not that easy. Maybe not incredibly hard, but it's not that easy maybe to get to Mauritania or to go to Morocco as a Pakistani. It's hard to even go between neighboring countries often as for locals of the countries. From Morocco going to Algeria is difficult. A Pakistani going to India is difficult. And so the fact that there's still this kind of global Muslim civil society in a certain sense, despite that difficulty, is very impressive. And on that note, the idea of a more united Muslim world, such as you say, is anecdotally and statistically supported. What form do you think people actually are looking for? Is it something like a Muslim EU, the Qaradawi idea, a block of countries with, some agreements, or does the common man have a more romanticized vision of how is to be united in basically one unitary state? What do you think when you survey people and you get this idea they want unity? What do they mean in a practical sense, if they even have a practical idea of what they want?
So I think this is a question that I get asked very often, and I think we tried very hard to get at it through surveys as to what sort of institutional arrangement do they have in mind when they're thinking of union or the Ummah. And I think, and with that, like what kind, like because I also surveyed extensively on how people view the caliphate or what ideas come to their mind when they view the caliphate, which is a similar sort of topic. I think there is a great diversity in opinions in terms of what institutional arrangement should be there that brings the Muslim Ummah together. I think so. There are, if you ask open-ended questions, especially there, which you try to get more ideas, and then you get. It's very difficult to sort of come to generalizations there. But I can tell you one thing, that again, a lot of countries in the Muslim world do face a lot of governance problems. And I think what they expect from a khilafa or from any institutional arrangement that brings upon unison in the Muslim Ummah is that they want like basic justice, welfare, and this came up strongly in our research because actually Muslims, when they're surveyed, they also support democracy a lot. So more than 80%, if you look at numbers from the Arab Barometer, even from our surveys, they do support even democracy a lot. And when you ask them whether you support the Khilafah, like especially before ISIS, the strong numbers were even stronger. You did see a lot support for the Caliphate as well. And so the question is that I think there is a variety of institutional arrangements that they are in mind as to what can and what should be the case. But I think one thing is that they really yearn for welfare, justice, better living standards, maybe more representative government. So I think, or even just stability as well. So there is, I think, a lot of diversity, but there are some things that they want from at least an institutional
So
arrangement.
what I find interesting in that is that, of course, it's very understandable for people to want better living standards, justice. These are universal goods, right? But what's interesting to me is that people connect that with a sort of transnational government, right? Separate from the local, national government that they have already directly experienced. And I wonder, is this an example of there's a trope of like a kindly, benevolent emperor and a wicked vizier, in the sense that people will perceive the more distant center of government as being like benevolent and ultimately good and righteous, but the local government is full of corrupt and evil people. I wonder, someone who is hoping for some sort of bigger, united, Muslim government, whatever form it takes, do they imagine that the people that will be running this, larger Muslim organization are going to be more just than the ones that currently run the country that they live in?
So I think maybe I didn't make myself absolutely clear, but even from domestic politics, they want the same kind of things, such as welfare and justice. And so I think
Hmm.
this is so. I think, of course, when you're talking about Ummah or Khilafah, this is a more sort of transnational concept. But I think they want similar things from domestic governance as well as international governance. So I think that is sort of transferring. So what they want from domestic governance sort of is transferring to what they want from international governance. So I think what that, of course, points out at is that I think uh, there there are among the Muslim Ummah a lot of institutional arrangements that can be acceptable to the Ummah. And so
Well,
I think
Okay.
for those who want, I don't know, like to say that this one form of institutional government is more Islamic than the other. I think among the people, at least, I think there is a sense that I think many sort of institutional arrangements might be acceptable because there is no one big institutional arrangement that they say is better than the others. So some may favor more democratic arrangements, others may want sort of more expert based or more authoritarian forms. So there's not one thing. And you ask them, as I said, you ask them about democracy, and they want democracy as well. So yeah, I think in
well,
terms of institutions, that's a bit confusing.
yeah, I want to ask about that specifically, but if anybody is interested in going back to this is penned in your article, like published in 2024. The other legitimate game in town, understanding public support for the caliphate in the Islamic world. But again, the idea of democracy you mentioned in this article, and you've mentioned just now that over 80% of Muslims across various societies, they support democracy. And I want to square the circle, because I mean, there's a gap for me that exists here, which is, okay, I mean, independent of like current political context and all of these things, sure, democracy is a form of governance, the republic, and then you have other forms of governance as well. You can argue on the merits of that in a very theoretical way. That's fine. But like you said, we're speaking about perceptions of the Ummah. What do Muslims feel about the world? And one of the things that we mentioned at the very beginning was Americans have a very negative view of the United States of America. And as an extension, they view the UN negatively, because they see that that is, exporting the views of America. So there's, I mean, just a lot of negativity that's associated with America. And how do you separate then that as a Muslim, just a lay Muslim anywhere, in Islamabad or in like Cairo, that America, wherever it goes and wherever it's gone in recent memory, has been, to export democracy, to give the gift of democracy to the world, and that has yielded the deaths of millions and millions of people wherever they've gone. Most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So how is it that Muslims specifically, how is it that the Ummah perceives value within this idea of democracy, especially if they tend to associate, these political concepts with America and the effects of America within their region? I mean, is it just a conflation with economic output that you see in Western countries? They just assume that, oh, America is doing really well, so that must mean that democracy is really well, but they don't then connect the fact that it's through the exploitation of their lands and Central America and all of these places. How do they get to that conclusion?
So I think a lot is written on it, but I think one thing that you just mentioned in what you were describing as, I think some people definitely view, and some people like Mani Jamal, who's a dean at Princeton, has written about that, that some Muslims might look, or Arabs in her case, might look at democracy bringing more economic development, and that's why they're supporting democracy. I think that this is a prevalent view. But I should also add to this is that, for example, why is democracy so popular in public opinion? I think so. There are various answers to this. I think one thing that you also I think at least before the Arab Spring, there was this prevailing opinion in a lot of countries in the Arab world that if the Arab dictators or the Arab monarchies go, and if democracy really comes to the Arab world, and this also you can see this after the Arab Spring as well, so it's not just before the Arab Spring, that really that if the people do get power, they will be able to self-govern, and maybe their situations do get better. So I think this might be a result of the authoritarian or monarchical forms of government in a lot of the Muslim world. And therefore, I think some forces within the Middle East want that democracy doesn't come to the Muslim world, because that might lead to Islamists getting in power, or what they call as Islamists getting into power. So I think there is a sense among at least some people that a democracy would mean more self-governance, that would mean some form of a Muslim democracy even. So democracy doesn't
Mm,
necessarily mean a liberal democracy for them. It could be what some people have theorized as the Muslim democracy. And of course, at sort of the scholarly level, there's a lot of discussion whether democracy and Islam can coexist, whether they're compatible, and there are all kinds of theorizations on
sure.
the sovereignty of people versus the sovereignty of Allah. But I think to the common man, those debates really uh, don't seep in that well, although they might know a little bit about them, but they don't really seep deep, whether they're thinking of sovereignty of God and sovereignty of people, and whether they think these are two different concepts,
Mm,
whether they can coexist or not. But I think for them, I think generally this might be true that they do
yeah.
associate democracy with more self governance and more economic prosperity.
So if we take a look, like just like to play it out in a paradigm, such as Egypt, for instance, right? The people feel that we are more religiously oriented. However, the dictator that rules us is more secular and perhaps a puppet of like Western nations and so on. The way that we counteract that is to take authority from him to ourselves, and so then they would elect somebody like Morsi and the Ikhwan, and then of course, like historically, whatever happens. But that's the intention behind it. They say that okay, the West has autonomy because that autonomy rests within the people, and if we want autonomy for ourselves, then we have to take it for ourselves, as opposed to relenting that to any single individual or something of that nature.
That's correct. And I think that could also be true for a lot of other countries as well. I think so I work also on bit on attitudes in Iraq, and Iraq was interesting in that I think if you survey them currently, I think, for example, previously they used to be, like, Caliphate was a more positive word before ISIS, but now I think it's
Mm.
not a very positive word because I think they were directly affected by ISIS so much. And
Yeah.
also in terms of democracy as well, I think Iraqis, for example, now do tend to sort of want more stability for some. Than because they thought, because the idea was America was bringing democracy and this is what democracy did. So I think you do find also variations in that, in public opinion. But sometimes, as you just said, that democracy can have notions that this might bring about more chaos and less stability, and maybe we should not go through this chaos and loss of lives and loss of everything. And
Yeah.
maybe it's not meant for us. So I think there is that opinion as well. But I think generally speaking, democracy still remains popular among the Muslims because, as the reasons that you stated and the example of probably
Yeah.
the Ikhwan that you gave.
So I feel like ideologues kind of miss the point when they're saying that a democracy is it's a system of governance that's ideal, and others are saying the caliphate in a very authoritarian way is the ideal system. They miss the point that the ummah just wants stability. Like give it to them this way or that way, but give them stability. Recently, I was in Turkey, and what's very interesting is Junaid and I, we went to Turkey together several years ago, and it was really palpable in the atmosphere. They really did not like, Turks did not like refugees within their country. Obviously, not every single one of them, but a lot of them, the majority of them, were not happy with refugees in their country. And that was tied, I mean, very much to the economic situation at the time. Even though the economic situation, you can find like other variables for why it was the case, even if it was engineered, from the West. Whatever the situation is, people they found the refugees as being outcasts, Syrian refugees in specific. I just went recently, and a lot of these attitudes have shifted. And so I was asking the same, one of our colleagues, an elder brother, who himself he's from an Iranian background. Do you feel that shift? Because I felt it, and he works with Turks, and he says, yeah, that shift is absolutely there, because economically the country is doing a little bit better. A lot of the people who had come, they've now relocated, they've gone back, and so it's almost as if that resentment or for the outcast was for something else. It was just economics. And I feel like even with political governance or the nature of the politics and governance that's there, it's really and I don't want to like make it seem Marxist and like economic determinism, but it is tied to just the economy. If the economy is good, if people have jobs, if they have food that they can put on the table, then they're happy. If not, then they're upset. Like in Germany right now, everyone hates Merz because gas is the highest it's ever been. Um, just the prices are out of control.
I would say economy definitely, but economy as well as sort of general justice for all. I think that's also one thing that, again, a lot of populations in the Muslim countries lack, and we find that in public opinion data as well, and some sort of rights for everyone in terms of collective rights or I think so. These feelings of justice and welfare are quite much prevalent in the Muslim world. I think yes.
How do you find like just developing on this a little bit? Then, if a government is able to provide, social justice and effective security, like let's take for example the Taliban, because whenever we think about the Caliphate or the idea of like Islamic governance, this is one of those movements that like comes to mind and like stokes a lot of fear in people's minds. But they have since the end of the war, a lot of effective security policies. They've even like built a lot of drug recovery centers that have helped rehabilitate drug users from the war. At the same time, they do morality policing. This is well known, also with regard to the extension of morality policing going into things like education and preventing women from education after a certain point and so on. Like, what does it say about the ummah? Like, where do they draw the balance? Where do they draw the line? Because I know for a lot of people who are Muslims, they're devout Muslims, and they want to practice Islam, but they want that practice to still be kind of up to them, and they want to retain that autonomy to themselves and to their own families, as opposed to having like a government enforce that. So yes, even if let's say some of these social justice issues are taken care of, welfare is taken care of, I still want independence to be able to police myself in terms of morality the way I want, or my family the way that I want. But I don't want to relegate that to a government. Uh, is that fair? Like, what is it that Muslims want when they envision uh, um, like when they envision a government, because these two things are not independent of one
Yeah,
another, right? It's
yeah.
the same ideology that informs the welfare is going to be that which informs the morality policing.
So, firstly, I like to say that I'm not an expert in Afghanistan, but of course, and I've never been to Afghanistan, so I can't report on how people in Afghanistan really, really view the Taliban. The survey data that exists on Afghanistan is also not very good. And I think, but of course, I have interacted with Afghans and throughout my life actually also because yeah, people that worked in the van transit, but also the Deobandi masajid, especially in Karachi and all, they were very close to the Afghan Taliban and all. But I think I see here differing views on the Afghan Taliban as well. I think one section of society among Muslims and also, for example, among Pakistan, really idolize the Taliban in terms of sort of their strict interpretation of Islam. They see themselves as a miraculous force that was able to defeat a NATO force that was almighty. They also see them as of course, rejecting Western values, but also being quite steadfast in the rejection of of Western values, and not like the Gulf countries, which they see as a bit here and a bit there. Like they see the Taliban as very steadfast in what they believe in and very strict in what they believe in. Others, so I anecdotally again, so not data wise, I've known people that again went to Afghanistan in search of living under such a regime, and they didn't feel comfortable and came back to Pakistan, and some really wanted to come back to Pakistan. And so I think life under them may not be so easy, and I think maybe for people living there, it's not very comfortable. I can't say for sure, but I'm just talking anecdotal. So I think people do like freedoms, and people. I think it's different. It's different when you are admiring someone from a distance and
So,
living
mm,
under that regime. Um, I think, theoretically speaking, I think generally, if you look at survey data, people do like more freedoms rather than less freedoms. And I'm not sure. I think, of course, the women that come after living under Taliban. I think especially, but those are women that of course have some sort of escape from the Taliban. They are quite negative of the Taliban and their lives under them, and they want to better their lives, and hence they left Afghanistan. But I think some other people would say that maybe the Taliban are doing what is correct, and maybe some of the societal evils that have come in the West have come because you're not adhering to the sort of strict Islamic principles. But I think there's a diversity of opinion. I think I can't give a definitive opinion here. I think just speaking anecdotally, I've had different views and different feelings about the Taliban, especially here in Pakistan.
Mm.
So it's an interesting conundrum for some, where they might, as Muzamil was getting at, some people might want to separate the different elements of what they might like and dislike in a government like the Taliban. Like they'd say, some people you might say, from based on what I'm hearing from you, there are a lot of Pakistanis who would love a Taliban-style government, except they would let the women do education in an unrestricted way, and they wouldn't police people's morality, make sure to go to the mosque, but everything else can be the same. And yet, the world is not always so neat. As Rizal said, this is a particular movement that packages these things all together, right? Or likewise, you might want the Gulf's prosperity, but you don't like the Gulf's moral legal regime, something like this. Do you think that some Muslims are unrealistic, or not thinking of not thinking of countries as sort of a bundled group of ideas, or is there some missing middle for some Muslims who are not getting what they want out of their government or of any government?
So I think again, Muslim public opinion is influenced by a lot of factors, and again, one thing is how, of course, certain elites formulate their opinion as well. I think currently, for example, in Pakistan, actually, opinion towards the Afghan Taliban is not very positive, and I think that's also because some of the rhetoric that's going around is not very positive about the Afghan Taliban. And previously, I think because at one time the Deobandis were in government for a long time and, of course, had control over a lot of mosques, I think they formulated a very positive opinion of the Afghan Taliban. I think so. I think there's a lot, of course, in what your religious leaders and what your elites say, and that translates into public opinion. But having said that, I think a lot of people within the Muslim Ummah did find the Taliban's steadfast resistance of NATO as miraculous and as something that was beyond imagination, because usually you wouldn't think that such a force can be resisted and eventually leaves Afghanistan. So I think there is a lot of different ways in, again, the formation of attitudes, and I think again these attitudes are formed from afar. So of course they're heavily influenced by elites and other things that are happening around. I think it becomes different when you survey the people that are living within these regimes, and I think that's also quite interesting. And I say I've not been there, so I can't say that for sure, even anecdotally. But the survey data there is also not quite reliable because of
Yeah.
various reasons. So I can't say for sure how do
Yeah.
people really feel living under
Yeah, I
the
think
Taliban.
honestly, like it's kind of a shortcoming on our part as students of, like, let's say, Islamic studies. A lot of the times we tend to look at the world, or we tend to like analyze politics through like ideological lenses, right? I have certain views on an ideology, and then I kind of expect that everything should be looked at through that vacuum, and the vacuum of ideology, as opposed to a lot of the things that are that play a role within that. So like a movement like the Taliban, again, in a vacuum, would yeah, sure, I love the idea of resistance. I love the idea of Muslim autonomy. I love the idea of Sharia, and I love the idea of ruling by the law of Allah. And when I think of that, I'm not thinking like a non-Muslim Texan or something like that who has a lot of fear in his mind of what that entails. I'm thinking of like Umar ibn al-Khattab. I'm thinking of like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. I'm thinking of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So I have those things, and I feel like, okay, I want that revival, and anybody who's claiming, to bring that about, then that's automatically something that's very positive in my mind. But again, there are like a lot of those realities that you study. The intersection of like not just ideology, but also politics and economy and like all of these things, and they play a role when like perceptions are made and they're developed and so on and so forth. And you can't divide that. So like I don't know, the way that for me personally I see it is like, yes, I mean, you as a regular Muslim, you're disenchanted with let's say the modernity as it impacts your family, as it impacts gender roles and so on and so forth. And then somebody is coming and they're saying, okay, we're going to radically change this, and we're going to completely turn it 180. And now you don't like that either. So what is the formulation in your mind that you have of where that line is, right? Have you drawn that to begin with? Is it something which is shaped by the media that you consume, or is there really like you're an intellectual who has read Islamic history and where those lines need to be drawn properly, and so then you agree or disagree with that movement based on your understanding of like history and society and so on and so forth. This is something which I'm fascinated to like know about the regular Muslim, like and yeah.
And I think, in one sense, Sheikh, both opinions, in my opinion, can be correct. I think it is true, of course, that I think the way feminism has evolved in the West may not be very conducive to uh, like the Muslim family that we would like to have. And in the sense here, actually, probably you need more women's rights, because of course there's a lot of marital violence, and there is, and so I think maybe there is something in between, because here when people are looking there and they're like, oh, look how they're treating their wives and etc., that it's not very positive here. And there also there is the family model is going, it's destroyed itself almost. And so I think maybe a middle somewhere, I don't know, but I think we've yet to find
Yeah,
that in that
for sure, for
side.
sure. I also, I mean, I do find that like media perception plays a big role. I mean, just that issue that you're speaking about. I mean, there's both sides of the coin, right? One side of the coin is that girls are prevented in this movement from accessing a certain level of education for reasons that they like tie to ideology and faith and so on, and that can be debated. At the same time, I think from like cultural trends, sometimes women are oppressed, and they're not given their rights. I think an issue of inheritance was quite big in that region. But at the same time, now you see videos of like the qudat, the judges in their system, forcing the men to give women their inheritance and not to like prevent them from it and so on. So a lot of it, again, it goes. I think it goes back to perception, but and not to drag on too long about this, I want to shift to another paper of yours, if that's okay, Junaid. The next, if you have any other questions or okay.
تفضل.
So the next paper that you
Go ahead.
have, this is it's titled "Foreign Policy Attitudes Toward Islamic Actors: An Experimental Approach." This argues. So now we're looking at it the other way. I was just talking about what I perceive as the Sharia, but that regular
Yeah.
Texan, my neighbor, is not going to be looking at it the same way. They're not going to be looking at Muslims the same way either. They have a lot of other
Yeah.
things that come to mind, and you kind of research this. So you argue that Western public opinion towards foreign actors is strongly shaped not simply by whether those actors are Muslim, but by how Islam is signaled politically. You use a survey
Yeah.
experiment based on the Syrian civil war, showing that attaching Islamic cues, specifically references to Sharia law, which I hope no non-Muslims are watching this and without context of what we're talking about when we say that we love the Sharia, and what we imagine when we imagine the Rashidun Khilafah
Yeah.
and everything. But like Islamic rhetoric, like Allahu Akbar, or labels such as Islamist, all of these, they significantly worsen Western attitudes towards the actor in question, affecting emotions, threat perception, and policy preferences. Among these cues, the Sharia policy cue has produced the strongest negative reactions, and the effects compounded when multiple cues they appeared together. Um, I think, again, you're the researcher. You have the statistics that you've done, anecdotally as well. I mean, it's common knowledge. I work as an imam, or I was working as an imam recently in Texas, and you see that just the word Sharia, that's enough to end
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
conversation. Recently, in fact, forget even Sharia. Tucker Carlson, he had a very interesting tweet just like 2 days ago. Those in government, they don't want you to know this, or those in power might not like you to know this, but Muslims actually love Jesus. And the barrage of hatred that people, and maybe we'll talk about Twitter as well, maybe it's my own feed and the way that it's like trying to troll me and bug me, but like the amount of hatred he's getting just for suggesting that Muslims love Jesus Christ, it's not a corrosive message, it's not something that's hateful, but they, just
Yeah.
Islamic theology, Islamic belief, the idea of Sharia, it's enough to just turn people. And it's remarkable how that is the case. um what factors, again, I don't mean to go on, but the question is, what factors can we highlight that have led to such reactions to these Islamic cues? Are there any studies that have been done like pre 9/11 that studies the effects of the incident, and the war on terror thereafter, against Islam and against Muslims on the same topic? How much of a role do you feel like 9/11 has played in understanding the concepts of jihad and Sharia? I mean, previously, there are movies that celebrate the idea of jihad. I forget the name of that one film, but at the beginning of it, maybe Rambo?
It was
Yeah, it was Rambo.
Rambo.
It said at the beginning,
It was a Rambo movie where
yeah,
he fights in Afghanistan.
dedicated to
Yeah.
the brave
Mujahid.
mujahideen. Yeah, yeah.
Mujahideen.
And there was
Yeah.
even one general. He said something funny. He's like, the U.S. general. He was saying something against like either the Taliban or Al Qaeda or something. You're not mujahideen. We're mujahideen.
We we're the
We're the
real
real
Mujahideen.
mujahideen.
Yeah.
So what
Okay.
happened? Yeah,
Well,
how did this change like occur?
yeah.
So I think our paper was actually one of the first papers that looked at Islamic cues. This was published in 2016, and actually we did a survey experiment somewhere in 2014. And at that time, sort of the Syrian war was going on, but was salient, but not that salient among the American public. So it was actually the perfect time to do the survey experiment. I just want to give you some context. So as you said, I think when you do survey Muslim populations, there is very, very high support for. So there was a Gallup study. It's a very famous book, like Who Speaks for Islam, from John Esposito, in which I think he goes into and asks this question, Sharia as a basis of law, like how what Muslims think about that, and they were like huge majorities, 80-90%, even in our surveys. I think the support for Sharia is high. So I think Sharia does, um, again, the concept of Sharia does have a lot of support among the Muslim population again. But and then I think some researchers, and this is Elizabeth Nugent, I think, and Christine Fair, they had a paper um, on and like so Muslims do support Sharia, but what does Sharia really mean? And this is again something along the
Yeah.
lines of what does the Caliphate actually mean? And so, in the sense
Yeah.
that there are various conceptions of Sharia among the Muslim population as well. So this is also very interesting. But one thing that our paper especially showed was what you were pointing at, that when, for example, we gave the cue that the foreign Islamic actor wanted to enact Sharia law, everyone, sort of Republicans, Democrat, all across sort of the political spectrum in the US got really afraid of this foreign actor. When we used cues that were like Allahu Akbar, even Islamists, the Democrats were not so negative. They were still fearful of this foreigner, but not so much than Republicans. So I think there is a difference in how Americans might perceive foreign Muslim actors, but especially when they use these buzzwords like Sharia, Khilafah.
Mm.
I think the populations in the West get really afraid of these foreign Islamic actors, and I think this also, I think, points out towards like I don't know if I was a policy advisor saying that oh you want to enact a new system or like a new government in one of the developing countries or developing Muslim countries, whether you want to use these buzzwords such as Sharia or a caliphate, because that makes sort of external Western actors really afraid of you. But again, that's again another debate altogether. But I think the big finding, and actually
Yeah.
we wrote something on the monkey cage, which was part of the Washington Post previously as well, um, on the same topic, that again these buzzwords Sharia, Khilafah really scared get, and I think this can be part of course, because how the media has portrayed these terms and used these terms. And to as far as the question of before 9/11, I think such studies didn't exist. I think didn't we didn't find any, and I'm pretty sure there weren't any before 9/11. And so I think
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these perceptions, they might be ad hoc because of, like, the war on terror and 9/11 and so on. Because, I mean, in reality, like you're talking about, Democrats don't have that much fear. When in reality, our ethics and our values specifically, would seem to, like, go directly in the face of liberal social values that the Democrats they represent. I mean, now it's kind of changing, where conservatives are starting to learn more about Islam in a neutral way, or in a more favorable way
Yeah.
again, through, like, even Tucker Carlson, Fuentes, Candace Owens, and others. Every now and then, they paint the Sharia in a positive light. But do you feel like when you did the study, and
Even Donald
even
Trump,
Donald Trump, yeah,
in an infamous
so
rant,
they were.
saying, the women, they wear the whatever. It's easy. You don't have to wear
Whop,
makeup.
honey,
Just put it on.
yeah,
Isn't that better?
yeah, whop,
Yeah.
I'm ready.
So So I'm talking again in general terms, but there were a lot of moderating effects that we found in the study as well. And one was related to knowledge of Islam, although we asked basic questions on whether the respondent had knowledge of Islam. But one thing that we found through our survey is that people who had little knowledge of Islam were more favorable, and then someone who was in between had not much and not less, maybe because they knew the Prophet of Islam, they were actually very negative or fearful of Islamic actors. And those then had more knowledge, were less fearful. So these people in between, through our survey at least, we saw that the people in between that know a little bit but not that much were most fearful of Islamic actors. And the one at sort of less, very little
Yeah.
knowledge and a lot of knowledge, they weren't as fearful. So I think that was one of the moderating
I
effects we found.
yeah. I think that's a very intuitive finding, like, that matches with, what you might, if you think about it, in that someone with zero theoretical red knowledge about Islam, they're just going to base their perceptions on people that they know personally. So they know a guy, Abdullah, they see him at work, and he's a normal guy, and there's nothing strange or scary about him. So positive. And then I think we've all met lots of these sorts of people that have done a little bit of online research on Islam, and they end up on some anti-Muslim site where it's going to be a list of verses, hadith saying, fight the disbeliever and kill him and execute the so and so and all that stuff. And they'll read, "Oh my God, Prophet Muhammad fought in wars, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's evil. How could he fight in a war?" And then, of course, people that know a lot are more sensible. So, anyways, it's kind of a not surprising and surprising at
But
the
it's
same time.
Yeah,
good to show it with data as well, I think.
does your
It's nice to have the data to back up this. this intuition.
Does your study take a look at like where people are getting their information? Because I feel like there's a component of that needs to be factored in here as well, right? Yes, like let's say if somebody is getting just no knowledge about Islam other than the very basic, then fine. If they have a lot of knowledge, then fine. But if they were getting like positive knowledge, or at least from like Muslim sources, let's say that are not, negatively portraying Islam or selectively choosing things to portray Islam negatively with, then they would still have a positive outlook of Islam. Do you think there's a component of that here?
So I think we don't do this in this survey. We did it in like other surveys. We didn't ask them like where they were getting the information from. Actually, one of my co-authors, Daniel Silverman, has a chapter in his book on this as well. Like where people get their information from is also quite important. But in this survey, we did not do that. We did ask basic questions on like how much sort of media sort of consumption do they have, but we didn't ask where do they get the information from. But that might have yielded interesting results. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I feel like it definitely. I mean, would have an impact. The amount of impact is what would be interesting to see. But this reminds me, before I just forget another anecdotal thing. I was with my wife at Costco a couple months ago, or more than a couple months ago now, and there was this nice old lady, Christian, and in her 70s or something, and we just got to talking, like, hey, hi, how are you, oh, where are you from? Obviously she sees my wife wearing hijab, and I think I was also dressed in like a thobe and a kufi. So she's just, she's interested, and then we tell her, oh, we're Muslim, and then we just she's like, okay, do you guys have any kids? And so on. I said, no. Do you have any kids? And she says, oh yeah. And then, but I have just one daughter, unfortunately. And so she said it like in this way, which caught me off guard, anyways. But then I told her, oh, in our faith, when you have a daughter, then we congratulate you, and we say that congratulations, for the prophets were fathers of daughters. And she was like, oh wow, I had no idea, that's so interesting. And she's like just fascinated by that, and she's like, tell me more, and like all of this, and like, and she was like, yeah, I go to church, I've been going to church regularly for my whole life, and I've really like never heard anything about Islam, I don't know any of that. And it's kind of what you said, like she didn't have a negative impression of Islam. She was just like interested. It's just a different culture or whatever. At her church, they didn't like really tell her anything one way or other about the faith, so she was interested, and she took it very positively. Alhamdulillah. I do think that getting away from like political analysis, just in terms of the amount of da'wah that's required for Muslims in a place that's as Islamophobic as Texas is, at least on a government level, and with all the policies that they're trying to do to shut down like Muslim development plans and mosque expansions, and to shut down the civil rights organizations like CARE and so on. Just sheer da'wah would make such a positive impact. I'm not trying to downplay the da'wah that is already happening, or that or the fact that there are definitely agendas that are in play to make sure that Muslims are outcast, and they're marginalized. But still, da'wah to the lay person is so important, because there are so many women and men and adults and youth that are like her, who just have no idea about Islam, and perhaps haven't gotten so many negative perceptions from the media about Islam. They just haven't consumed that, or don't really take it that seriously, and dawah would do
Yeah.
them so well. Junaid, I mean, I would love to hear your perspective on this as well. Like, I mean, coming from the background that you do you feel like that's the case with a lot of people, or it's already like that chapter has turned?
Well, as as both of you have been talking, that the idea has germinated in my mind that we need some sort of like Muslim IPAC in the American context, right? Like a Muslim organization with a lot of money that is just caring to a significant extent about improving public opinion about Muslims. Not just in America, of course, but
Well,
in
that's what we have
all these
Qatar
countries that have
for.
millions of Muslims, like Germany. Yeah, Qatar
Qatar.
funding Tucker
Yeah.
Carlson, as he's now known. And I think it's significant that those people you mentioned, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, and so on, who are known in the American political science, all of these people are off the mainstream, right, of American conservative media or any media. And so it's kind of funny. It's interesting that the more positive receptions of Islam are among people that have been pushed out of the mainstream media space, suggesting that people in the mainstream space have a vested interest. They don't want the American public to be have a friendlier view of Islam. In terms of educating people, I don't know what can be done because, as you guys have been saying, the knee-jerk reaction against any of these Muslim cues, to use Dr. Isani's uh, terminology, is so strong, and in many people, it's been built up over decades now, since like 2001. I don't know what can be done. I was talking to someone I know recently who's not Muslim, and they said something to the effect that, oh, and these particular Muslims, they support Sharia, which is horrible. And I just didn't even say anything because what can I say that actually all Muslims practice, live by Sharia in some sense? There's nothing to say. So I don't know what form any kind of education would take or public policy. Maybe Dr. Isani has some insights on, dealing with the wider public to improve the Muslim image in diaspora countries.
Yes. So I think again there is also some research done on like what can improve Muslim opinion of in diaspora countries. I think some people just say the contact hypothesis is very popular, saying that it's just that some people are sort of Islamophobic just because they haven't had enough contact with Muslims. But again, this some findings actually show other. Some research shows other findings that actually where there are more Muslims, there might be more. So I think it's still inconclusive as to again what works in terms of improving Muslim attitudes towards diaspora. But actually, I think again, a lot of this is again, you cue them with or the media framing of Muslims. And I think generally that really matters. And of course, that overrides itself again if you know a Muslim really well or an example of a good Muslim that you work with or you have gone to school with. And so I think there are many factors again that shape public opinion towards Muslim diaspora countries as well.
Well, I want to get a little bit further away from Texas, and also a little back to Muslim perceptions. You have another article titled "The Desire for Sovereignty: An Explanation of EU Attitudes in the Arab World." You look at Arab publics and the Ummah. I mean, within the Arab world, you find that they're quite skeptical of the European Union than most other regions in the world. You used the Arab Barometer Wave 3 data, which surveys 12 Arab countries, to argue that Arab attitudes towards the EU are shaped primarily by a desire for sovereignty, meaning like collective dignity and resistance to external interference, rather than purely economic evaluations or elite cues. There are utilitarian factors such as economic expectations and cue taking mechanisms, such as trust in domestic governments, that also influence EU favorability. However, the strongest explanatory factor is ideation concerns over external reform pressure and post colonial sensitivities about autonomy. Um, to sum it up, basically, Arab populations are suspect of the EU because of the influence that they have over the region and in terms of trying to shape their politics and their governance and so on and so forth. But what you do try and conclude is that The skepticism that people in the Arab world have against the EU is rooted less in just ignorance or anti-Western sentiment, but it is more historically conditioned concerns that tie into self-determination and the idea of political dignity in general. Of course, we know the Arab, that this is like, a strong component of what makes them who they are and the identity that they have. Literally, wars have been fought throughout their entire history for the idea of dignity. So the question
Yeah.
again that I want to have, that I want to pose to you right now is, based around this. Do you feel this is still the case right now after like more recent political events and the conflict that's taking place between the Gulf and Iran, or between America, Israel, and Iran, to which the Gulf is, caught in the middle of? Has the EU maintained its favorability, uh, or rather developed it, given its ambivalence towards the U.S. foreign policy against Iran? Or do you think that this would have had a positive effect in the Arab world, considering that the EU was not interfering? Um, do you think that's positive, or do you think that's negative because Iran is still attacking, Gulf countries, and you find a lot of Gulf governments and leaders trying to argue for more Western involvement to repel these attacks against their infrastructure?
Okay, so I think these are two different questions. I think because I think with Iran,
Yeah, that was a lot all at once.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think firstly, Sheikh, thank you so much. You summarized the article really, really well. Uh, so I think firstly, I want to comment on the article with. So we found out initially from other data that global attitudes mainly that again that Arabs were less favorable towards the EU as compared to peoples from other countries in the world. We use the Arab barometer data here. It's also a very good source of data from the Arab world among the Arab publics. And we found out that the desire for sovereignty, which I came from, so this question on whether uh, you like external demands for reform imposed on you, and people who were against the imposition of external demands for reforms were also very much against the EU in that sense. It was the most sort of significant factor in our model. And I think that, as you summarized it quite well, I think there is a great feeling that some of the things that external actors come with promoting in the Arab world or in the Muslim world are not necessarily what these publics need. So there is um, a gap between what is being demanded and what is being supplied. Of course, as you know, some of these programs, like for example, it's very important with climate change or gender rights or something. Again, if you don't have enough food to put on the table, then this comes a bit later. But sometimes, of course, there is a bit of, and again, some of these things are as sometimes imposed, and then this is not liked, and I think that determines some of the opinions of the publics towards external actors like the EU. With this current conflict, I think it's interesting how this is developing, in that again you have the UAE and Israel that want to continue the conflict so as to inflict as much damage to Iran as possible, so that it, of course, cannot harm them later. So as much that others in the Middle East have different opinions, even again, I think there's a difference in how Qatar is looking at and Saudi Arabia is looking at compared to the UAE, and they want the conflict to end. And I think Pakistan is playing this mediating role, supported by Saudi Arabia and other countries that I mentioned, including Turkey as well, so that this can come to an end, because they think that this would not be in their long term interest, that Iran becomes more unstabilized and it could be pose a problem. So I think there's a divergence in opinion among, at least right now, the leadership elites in the Muslim world as to how best to deal with this current conflict. And I think, again, similarly, I think a lot of people in the Muslim world, I think, in that sense, would like this conflict to end because, as we were talking about even earlier, the impacts, political, economical, are tremendous in the developing Muslim world. And I think most people would like this to end as soon as possible, whatever it may take. End this as soon as.
Indeed. We hope that you there in Islamabad can exercise some positive influence on the negotiations.
Yeah, currently, we are having a lot of interesting talks
Different
among
things.
the policy and academic circles here, and hopefully, some of that seeps in.
Inshallah ta'ala, no, definitely. We do hope that it
Hope
goes
so.
outside of
It's a joke, but it's also not a joke.
we hope it
Yeah,
goes outside
you
of
have
that academic
influence.
space and into those like think tanks that are behind the negotiating tables and
Yeah,
so on.
actually, in Pakistan, I think it's to other places as well. I think the higher academia is also closely related to policy. I think
Okay,
so some of that does seep in.
that's amazing, mashallah. Well, that kind of brings up a
Good.
different question in
Very
my
good.
mind. That's completely unrelated to this, but I will ask this anyways. Do you think, like, I mean, your role, the way that it's like transition and what you've chosen to like go into? Do you think it? I mean, it, if somebody wants to like actually affect positive change, and policy decisions and so on, do you think this is a good route to go down, and that it would actually impact the decisions that are made on the negotiating table, or like by leaders?
Okay, so I think some academics actually, uh, throughout their academic life, do not affect policy that much. They want to remain very academic. I
Yeah,
actually, through my work and through the groups that I've associated with, are pretty much linked to policy and science diplomacy.
yeah,
And so I work with a lot of think tanks, research groups that directly affect policy in a lot of places. So I think this is a route that can be taken, but it is a difficult thing to do because you want to be publishing academically and to do the policy thing. So you probably have to work harder to achieve both.
yeah.
And so, but it can definitely be done. And yeah, I try to do both, and hopefully, I'm making a little bit of difference at least.
Yeah, inshallah. No, I mean, we appreciate your contributions in the academic space. And I've read through a lot of your
Yeah.
articles now, and I see like the value that they carry. But all of that in one place, if you save the world from nuclear Armageddon, then, we're even more appreciative of that fact. So Allah reward you for that. Also, I mean,
Like,
I
in
mean,
Germany, mashallah.
it's not. Can I just? It's not always that. Like, that on the surface this is the biggest thing, but on the back of it, of course, there have been talks regarding this to conflict and how so these perceptions are shaped. Like I've worked, for example, also I'm working currently on perception of the Abraham Accords, and I've been involved with actors talking about that. So I think there's a lot of work being done in the background in policy circles as well that does not make it to sort of the headlines, but does affect countries' policies. And I think it is quite rewarding to be able to affect some of those debates.
Yeah,
For
no,
me,
definitely.
especially.
I mean, I live. Speaking as somebody now, I followed your footsteps in marrying into a German family. My in-laws, they come from an Afghan background. I see, kind of the impact of like perceptions about Muslims here, and how that's affected, my family itself, and growing up and facing some of the challenges that they've faced and some of the struggles that they've had to overcome. So and I know that, mashallah, your work ties in as well when you were in Germany with addressing some of these concerns on both a structural, like institutional level, and also just in terms of like racism within the public and so on. So alhamdulillah, I mean, there's not enough that's happening of that, and I think you're one of the few people that I know who comes from is not just trying to change this in a positive way, but organically you understand the Muslim perspective, and you're working to change that institutionally over there. So that's that is quite a great contribution, inshallah,
And
even if it's not.
hopefully we have more Muslims doing that as well. I think, of course, there's a lot of people wanting to do that, but I think we need more very good Muslims to become part of academia and the policy space. It is a difficult line to also follow because, of course, when I'm doing my academic work, I actually want to be as objective as possible. In my sort of understanding is to like very honestly present what my data states, and I think that can be learned across the political, across the political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, because I basically try to report as objectively as possible what my data is saying, and I think and a lot
Mhm.
of people can learn from that, and I think a lot of positive findings have come from my work from like for the Muslim Ummah as well. I think on how sort of
Yeah.
Muslims portray things, and how I we might talk of some of my other works as well, but I think this has been a positive externality of that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I do think, obviously, like, if you want to address a problem, you have to first know what it is. Otherwise, if you don't, like, understand it for all its dimensions, you're not going to be able to solve the issue. So you have to be very objective, and try to, like, highlight the issues as they are. I want to just get back to the conversation that we were having about the Arab states and the idea of autonomy and political
Yes.
dignity. How do you find recent? And I know this Arab barometer wave. It doesn't look at, like, Saudi and the UAE in particular, but how do you feel, or do you have any other data that, like, points to how recent, like, reforms in the Gulf have been perceived by the population? Are they, like, popular social reforms because it seems to be promoted by Arab leaders themselves, the royal families, or is there a consciousness that it's still, like, Western influence and there are economic imperatives that shape the policymaking of these leaders at the cost of their social identity and like dignity and autonomy as an Arab people, as a Muslim people?
Yeah.
So, is this with special reference to Saudi Arabia? Because I think that's where it's, at least in the last few years, that's where the
It,
most sort of on the ground change has taken place.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
he's speaking
So,
obliquely, but yes, you've correctly
uh,
intuited what he meant.
I think so. I was a professor at King Fahd University, which is regarded as the best undergraduate school in Saudi Arabia for engineering in all subjects, and the best university scouts, but that doesn't have an undergrad program. So we had probably some of the best. The creme de la creme of Saudi students, as you may call it, in at King Fahd University. And I think because while I have done survey work in Saudi Arabia, and I also surveyed my students while they were there as well, and I think at least I think as I as I just alluded to, I think some of the biggest on the ground reforms in the Arab world in the past few years have been in Saudi Arabia. A lot of things in which, as you know, the mutawas are not forcing people to go to pray. And for example, now, except in Makkah and Medina, the qira or is not done loudly, in, for example, for Isha and Maghrib. And so a lot of sort of religious sphere things have changed. Women are now allowed to drive. And how does a population that is at least was religion was a big part of, so this pan Islamism was a big part of Saudi foreign policy as well, and how did such a population deal with such? And I think I can tell you from sort of, this is more sort of data from King Fahd University as well. I think there were two sections of people. I think there is a younger group of Saudis that is pro Mohammed bin Salman, a young group that wants change and sees Saudi bureaucracy as inefficient. That was previously, and there is a group that does view this more skeptically, and this is especially from the religious circles. But I think overall, if I so this is again the selection bias that I'm talking about here is that King Fahd University is already an elite institution, so you'll get more people that are sort of more progressive in the sense of wanting change and wanting, they do adhere to Maulana Salman more. I think that would be a selection effect. But I think overall, I think there is skepticism. But I think in a society like Saudi Arabia, what I also learned is that there is. I think whatever comes from the top, especially from the king and the crown prince, is adhered to, and things change quite quickly there. I remember just anecdotally, I think sometimes during Ramadan we were just having classes, and suddenly an announcement comes from the king that there will be no classes in Ramadan, and we have to shut down our classes. So it's very direct. It's very, and whenever an order comes, people do listen to it. So I think there is a bit of that, but there is some skepticism. Um, uh, Maybe there is no reliable data, but I think maybe even majority skepticism, but it doesn't come out because in the public sphere because of uh, again the controls there, and again there's also some sort of confusion. I think a lot of my students at King Fahad, they said like they were having like a drinking party and it was raided, and they some of them spent times in jail because they thought things have liberalized in Saudi Arabia, but apparently they had not. Um, and they had to. And So I think there is a bit of confusion as to how much they've learned. There
Hmm.
are other people, of course, you know about the women's
Oh,
rights activists that began
Yeah.
writing after they thought Saudi Arabia has liberalized women's rights and they're allowed to drive, and they wrote in the newspapers, and then eventually got jailed, and so there is a bit of confusion as to how liberalized and on what things has Saudi society liberalized.
Right. I think the conflation that
yeah.
exists is that.
That's a,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, go
Yeah,
ahead, Bilal. I'll ask
yeah.
you
I was
after that.
saying, I think the conflation that exists in the mind of a lot of these liberal activists is that the power is shifting to them, as opposed to the the authority that is within, that rests like very much so within the kingdom, and within select few leaders. The authority remains with them. It's just their own personal uh, uh, like social values that have shifted, or whatever the case might be. But I was going to ask about something that you mentioned right there in the middle, which is compliance. Do you feel like popular compliance is tied more with fear or reverence of like the current government? Because in my experience, and again this is anecdotal, but when I was in Saudi, I kind of sensed this sort of spectrum as well, where you have some people who, I mean, everybody will comply, right? Nobody's there to you know raise the banners of like revolt or anything of that nature, if they don't want to disappear within the next 5 seconds. But for some people, it's definitely because I just fear the situation. I'm not going to question it. It's my life, and the life of my family is in question. And then for others, and especially amongst the youth that I spent some time with in places like Medina and in Jeddah and in Ta'if, they have a genuine reverence, and they have entrusted, the future of their country to the kingdom and to the leadership and the direction that it's taking, and they're looking forward to complying with that. And they don't see that as something that contravenes their religious identity either, because again, the wulatul umur, they know better, and they have scholars in their ears, and so on and so forth.
For me, I think in my sort of experience is definitely most out of fear. I think reverence because the legitimacy. I think there is some sort of legitimacy that has been created, but I think it's more out of fear than anything else. I think I was surprised, of course, There are a lot of people, for example, from my university wanted to go abroad to Canada or the US, and other people, because might be surprising for someone living in the US, who are like, oh, Saudi is a rich country, and it's a Muslim country, why would you want to move to the US or Canada? But there were many students that wanted to do that. So I think there is, of course, a lot of fear that makes uh, these actions and these orders being compliant. I think legitimacy, there is some sort of legitimacy. I think overall you could say that there is some sort of performance legitimacy. I think the bureaucracy did improve a little bit, I think, in this aftermath, but it's still very slow improvement, I must say.
If I could ask, if you could engage in a little more population opinion, speculative wish casting, or speculation without data. Um, on the Iran Israel America war, do you think that the Arab populations, both of the Gulf and of other Arab countries, feel that this war is potentially existential for them and merits involvement? In that Israel has kind of made it clear that they don't want to see any strong Muslim country around them. Um, do you think that the Arab publics perceive this as an imminent threat or just bluster, or do they think that this is just a fight between Israel and Iran that they just want to stay out of? Again, I know that you might not have data for this, but
So I think
according to your knowledge as a researcher who's worked on the area for so long.
So I work a lot on sort of Israel and its Abraham Accords and everything. So I know a little bit about this. So I think Israel's security framework works. It's not. So I think currently Israel likes to take it step by step. And I think the current threat they were facing was from their neighboring countries like Syria and Lebanon. And Syria, they've been able to control a little bit more in Lebanon. And of course, they knew that the actor that was behind this was Iran, and Iran needed to deal with. So, as Israel works is that first, of course, they have this sphere within Israel Palestine. So, the first immediate threat is within, of course, the West Bank and Gaza, then the neighboring countries, then the rest of the Arab world, and then the rest of the Islamic world, and then the rest of the world. And so I think, of course, Israel is also constrained as to how much it can act. And so I don't think the threat to the rest of the Muslim world is immediate, but of course, if it becomes more of a direct threat, then Israel will respond. But I think right now, Israel is taking it step by step, yes.
I mean, if we're speaking about the conflict itself, I do want to build a little bit more in terms of like perceptions and like the perceptions of the Ummah itself. Again, a lot of anecdotes here, but the perception that you grew up with, that I would hear from uncles in the masjid, was that the two parties, Israel and Iran, they're not even in conflict to begin with. They're just trying to harm the Sunni populations of the countries in between the two. Right, this was the like maybe it's the masajid that I grew up in, but this was predominantly the view of like Egyptians and Syrians and Gulf Arabs and so on and so forth. Even until recently, they cited like the assassinations of Ismail Haniya and Hassan Nasrallah and others to the fact because Iran did not respond immediately in kind. They're saying, look, this is like clear indication that these actors are not against one another. They're willing to sacrifice their most important allies and not respond in kind. They only care about themselves, and it behooves it's better for them to just work together. But I mean, with what just happened a couple of weeks ago, does that can we say, I mean, and I don't want you to necessarily be an ideologue, but as an analyst, that and because of your background as well, like you've studied Israel and the Abraham Accords and all of that, as you're just mentioning, like, is this perspective like entirely mistaken, like historically as well as like right now? Or is there still like some room for debate as to like the nature of the relationship between these two countries?
So I don't know about current public opinion data because, of course, now surveys are not being carried out currently, but like after the war and what effect has the war had on sort of attitudes towards Iran. But of course, across the Sunni world, as you just stated, there was skepticism both of Iran and of Israel. And Israel, of course, more so than Iran, but Iran was also viewed quite skeptically. And I don't know whether this war would make Iran more or less popular. I think what I definitely think, that Iran has definitely become very much less popular in the UAE. Maybe, of course, Iran has become less popular in the Gulf countries that it has attacked as well. I This is again an expectation. This is not talking on data, but I don't know whether other Muslims are seeing Iran as a hero figure, like some people here in Pakistan, on or like standing up against Israel. Um, so I think there would be, of course, in the Gulf, a bit of a different dynamic than the rest of the Muslim world. And again, countries like UAE are definitely very much anti-Iran in this, and other Gulf countries maybe as well, maybe Kuwait and Bahrain more so than Bahrain. Again, you can't say because of the demographic dynamic there.
Yeah.
Uh, but yes, so there might be a divergence. Yes.
I think anecdotally it is the case, as you suggest, that there's a pretty widespread worldwide sympathy for Iran, as in Pakistan, of the countries not directly involved in the conflict, right? That are not seeing missiles hit their country.
Yeah, I think, I mean, at the beginning, when Iran started like firing missiles into Qatar and Bahrain, you saw some like publics, like some people go out and they were celebrating that. I don't know how many of them are like expats from like Pakistan and India and so on versus like actual Qataris and Bahrainis, but you saw this. But I mean, nonetheless, there's only so much if you start, like, let's say they're going for critical infrastructure like desalination plants and so on. You can't expect the country to support that at that point because of some like ideological like understanding
Yeah,
of the conflict. Even I mean, the scholarship that traditionally was tied with like Sahawi Salafi like frameworks, that you would expect them to be more supportive of not necessarily Iran, but like a rejection of Israel, and going to war against Israel. Even many of them in the Gulf, some of these scholars that are tied to this have been quite hesitant, and even at times, publicly denounced Iran's actions. Again, and I don't think that's because of fear necessarily of their government, but also just a genuine concern for their own safety and well-being, and of the general population. So it's interesting to see this dynamic. I want to ask another question. There's a lot of questions that ties into this to the Iranian conflict, but do you know, like, or can you speak to like the political calculus that was taken by Iran in avoiding the building of a nuclear weapon all of this time? Is it like really tied to the fatwa of Ayatollah Khamenei, or is it that balance that they've been trying to strike between not being invaded and even more sanctions versus being dismantled entirely? And does it seem like they were mistaken in that calculation, like from a political, uh, yeah, just like a political analysis? Does it seem like that was the wrong calculation?
So I know that. So here in Pakistan, you do have access to a lot of Iranian embassy staff and some policymakers talking at academic events as well. And I think, in their opinion, that Khamenei's fatwa had a lot to do with Iran not going for nuclear weapons, and now that the weapon, now that Khamenei is not there, of course, the older Khamenei not being there, that they might go or even want to get nuclear weapons. And I think so. There must be some sort of fatwa effect. Of course, the Iranians historically also used like curbs on the nuclear program to get some sanctions relief as well. So it was a bit strategic as well. Like whenever they wanted some sanctions relief, they would bring up sort of that they would curb the nuclear program, which meant that, of course, which Israel is very worried about is their ballistic missile program. So they were able to build their ballistic missile program, even though they didn't build their nuclear program. And I think, for example, right now, Israel is really concerned about Iran's ballistic missile program, and they want this to be part of the negotiations. And we're not sure right now whether anything in the negotiations will talk about Iran's ballistic missile program, although this is Israel's one of Israel's big demands. Um, so let's see what happens. But of course, I think it had something to do with the fatwa, as well as it could also be strategic. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Do you feel that, so I mean, like with the current conflict right now, where do you think it's headed? We're at a pause right now. So they had a ceasefire that was agreed upon for 2 weeks. And I don't know, we'll try and get this out as soon as possible, inshallah. We're recording this on the 17th of April. The first set of, or the first, negotiating process did not go anywhere, did not yield anything, and now there's talks for extending the ceasefire and returning to the negotiating table. Trump seems to indicate that he might go himself. He might want, the same sort of photo op that he had with Kim Jong Un. He might try to do that with Pezeshkian, or I don't think Mujtaba Khamenei is going to show up and stand in front of somebody who killed his own, father. But where do you see that this is headed right now? Do you feel like, as tenuous as this, ceasefire is, it might be long lasting? Or do you feel that no, it is a temporary pause? America and Iran are using this time to kind of reset, make calculations going ahead, and then it's going to erupt once again, especially considering so many actors from Israel and even within like Zionist Christians in America and the American ruling elite want this war to continue.
They want to continue the fight.
So I think what's really clear right now is that I think Trump does want this to end, um, uh, but Israel and the UAE do not. They want it to be a little bit longer, to, as we began with, to again affect Iran's weapons assets and other infrastructure as well, to bomb that as well. So I think there is a divergence in what the US wants and what Israel and the UAE want. It would depend on, again, the relative, how much Israel is able to influence the US in this case. And I think for Iran, Iran does want it to end, but of course, I think what seems clear is that it does not want to push its allies like Hezbollah under the bus. Um,
Yeah.
so, yes, so I think it'll be interesting as to how this ends. But I think those are, and I think based on that, maybe we can expect a ceasefire, or sort of a permanent ceasefire, hopefully. And yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like you have a more of a positive outlook, with regard to like hostilities ceasing. What does it say for, like, you just mentioned, like, the UAE perhaps wants this prolonged for its own, like, ends. But does it not? I mean, just as a layperson who doesn't understand the, the minutia of, like, governance and how they're thinking and making policy, it just feels like when you see missiles being lobbed at the UAE, at Dubai, at near the Burj Khalifa and economic centers, and you're hearing right now is just hearing like there are a lot of positions in different industries that are open across the Gulf because like Western investment is just jumping out and going back to Europe, going back to the US and Canada. Would it not be in their favor for this to end as quickly as possible, or do you feel like it's not had a uh, an effect that that you can't return from? Like, how have these countries been impacted with what's already happened right now, and why would a country like UAE want this to continue, considering the damage it's done on their economy?
So I think what's clear is that I think the UAE is clear that if the constant threat of Iran remains, maybe it cannot attract the kind of investment, the Western interest, or interest from all over the world that it had in the past, because it would mean that someone right very close to their borders can bomb them at any time. So their whole model of providing 100% security to its residents and citizens would fall apart. I think so. I think the UAE does want a more sort of a regime change in Iran, or something that is more permanent rather than just a cessation of hostilities, because
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
constant threat would remain. And I think I am optimistic, but of course, I think there are certain things that, for example, Israel's north and Lebanon south. I think that would be also very difficult. You see the public opinion coming from Israel, like over 80% want at least the war with Hezbollah to continue, or the actions in Lebanon to continue. So it'd be very, very difficult to Netanyahu to even to stop hostilities there. So I think there is a lot to be, yeah, pessimistic about in the future, but hopefully, I still hope this ends for a little time. I think, although, as you know, this might become sort of more of a permanent um, conflict, in that uh, a lot of parties in the conflict think that now that Iran has acted in a certain way, things cannot be as were before. Um, so let's see what happens. But I hope, like for peace, and I that at least I think it's very difficult, as a lot of experts have pointed out, for change of regime in Iran, and affecting something more permanent in Iran. And if that's not the case, to what extent will you go then?
Yeah.
And those are
It,
big question marks.
don't you feel like the UAE's fear is perhaps misplaced a little? Because I mean, Iran has shown like restraint to a point of frustration, right? And it was the U.S. and Israel that first threw the first punch. Do you not like what is the calculation the UAE is making in not trying to reel in its Israeli partners, as opposed to just trying to finish the threat of Iran altogether, that has shown itself to be more of a mature actor as far as restraint is
I
concerned?
think I think on the Iran issue, I think UAE and Israel are quite close in what they want in Iran. On other issues, the UAE and Israel are a bit apart, especially with regards to the West Bank. I think those, with regards to the West Bank, I think Netanyahu and the UAE government are yeah, somewhat apart in their opinions and what can be done about settlers and everything. But on Iran, they're pretty much united in that they want something of a
Uh,
permanent solution there, which again, for me, is quite questionable as to how you could bring that about in
well,
Iran. And if you can't bring that about without
it,
crazy violence, then yeah, I don't think it's a very intelligent thing to do.
look, I think the danger for the Middle East and a lot of Muslims around the world generally is that if they cannot, you know, change the government in Iran or destroy the country, which appears to be the case, but if they nonetheless try as hard as they can to do so, they're going to engender a lot of hostility, long-lasting problems in the region that, again, have world effects everywhere, not least of all in Pakistan, where you are now.
Yes, for sure.
I have. We're getting over the 2 hour mark. I have just two questions that I would like to end with. One, I mean, and I think both of them are quite relevant to your study, but also to just us as an audience to the conflict, and how to like take everything in properly. You have an article that you published in 2020 called Methodological Problems of Using Arab Language Twitter as a Gauge for Arab Attitudes Towards Politics and Society. You argued that Arab language Twitter, which is like a hellscape, I'm not going to like mince words on that. This is one of the most frustrating things that has consumed my life personally. You say, much to my dismay, because I was taking it quite seriously, you say it cannot be treated as a reliable proxy for Arab public opinion without very careful methodological safeguards because of a number of issues: severe representative bias, uneven participation patterns, demographic distortion, surveillance effects, of course. I mean, just bots, right? Linguistic complexity and sentiment analysis limitations. So it does, like you mentioned, it is still a valuable corpus for studying the discourse, for setting the agendas on these issues, for activists who use it as a network for communication. But we should not generalize Twitter sentiments into broad Arab political attitudes unless you have done a lot of your, like background work to make sure that what you're getting is an accurate portrayal of reality. I want to just ask one question with regard to this, which is for the average Twitter user, like the activist Muslim Twitter user, maybe in the diaspora, sitting in the West, who is maybe has access to the Arabic language, but also a lot of that is translated and seeps in. Now you have AI, you click a button, you have access to everything at great grammar and morphology and syntax and all of that stuff. How does a person like myself, or a person like like us, how do we consume Twitter like properly? Like, how do we not use it in such a way that we end up having a completely distorted reality from what actually exists on the ground, or what is going to happen in the future, so that we don't end up looking like like buffoons when we talk about politics? And also tied into that, and you won't, but we will. I'm not an expert. You guys are props. You have a political science background, so you know these things better than me. But how do I avoid these pitfalls? And secondly, how do I recognize the difference between like these bots and the way that the algorithm is set up to like just annoy me and make me like more addicted to it? How do I work to not fall into that trap and to get the right information, and then to be like using it in a positive way, as opposed to being consumed by just a fake algorithm that makes me come to wrong conclusions and just hateful?
So I wrote this in 2020. It got published in 2020. I actually began writing this in 2019. And I think at that time, I, Twitter's algorithm was not as biased as it is now. And it didn't have as many bots as it has now. So I think, in my opinion, Twitter now is even become worse. And I think right now, I think even activists that had a really large following find it difficult for their post to get significance if somehow the algorithm doesn't like their content. So I think consuming Twitter and forming your opinion through Twitter, extremely problematic these days. Although, of course, we could, of course, try to follow as many of our own in the echo chamber and try to remain in that. But still, I think Twitter usage has become increasingly problematic. But I must say that some countries actually, like Saudi Arabia, actually per capita has the most Twitter users of any country in the Arab world. And Twitter is still a form of people protesting. Of course, they are not coming on the streets in Saudi Arabia, but the little protest that comes about in Saudi Arabia does come through Twitter. And after the Arab Spring, most Arab governments are have very good algorithms that again look at Twitter data very carefully to see the public sentiment. So again, it is one way of getting your voice heard, especially among Arab publics, especially if you're in Saudi Arabia or other countries that have very good surveillance. At least you will be heard on Twitter because they are people looking at your what you're saying. But again, formulating your opinion through Twitter, thinking of Twitter as representative has become increasingly problematic.
So your suggestion: go cold turkey.
I don't use Twitter that much these days.
Okay.
If even he's not reading Twitter very
Yeah.
much, what more of us?
No, then yes, I need to work on that myself. And for anybody who's watching as well, inshallah, please shut off your Twitter accounts and stop annoying people and getting annoyed by people. Um, the last question that I wanted to ask for myself is, uh, like a lot of these discussions, they come up cyclically. Um, many Muslims, they read every single conflict through like an eschatological lens. This is the end of times, and I don't think that's specific to Muslims either. A lot of Christians, a lot of Jews, they do the same thing, and a lot of modern policy that exists. With Israel trying to, some of their leading thinkers speaking and politicians speaking about the rebuilding of the third temple, the sacrificing of the heifer, and so on and so forth. And then Muslims also like looking at the ideas of Mahdi and Dajjal and so on and so forth, shaping their their ideas and their policies. How much? I mean, one, do you think, khalas, that's it? The Mahdi time has come. We should all like do hijrah to Mecca or Medina and just get ready. And two, from a more like political analysis, and theology as well. You have a background in both, and I know you've done some work on eschatology as well. How do we like avoid the two extremes, like secular dismissal of the unseen, where we just say no, everyone always just says the Mahdi, so we just ignore it? Because there are real things, like, I mean, Zionism. Historically, this is the first time since the fall of the Second Temple that Jews have come together in one place, and Allah Azza wa Jalla, He speaks about this in the Quran as well. We don't want to like completely deny any reality of the end times, and like just say that no, this is bakwas, it's not going to happen, it's just we've said this 1,000 times and this is just another one of those times, it's not real. So we don't want to go that far, but at the same time we don't want to be recklessly overconfident and try to fit every war and everything into this prophetic timeline, and make judgments based on that, because again, you've been wrong 1,000 times before, and we don't know what the future holds, and you don't want to speak on behalf of Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a way that is not befitting. So how do we balance that, and where is the balance theologically? Where is the balance from a political lens as well? Where do you find like Muslims should be?
I think so. Firstly, with your first point, I think no one can know when the Mahdi would come and when the end of times is quite near. Although we are, of course, I think through the Quran we know that, of course, we are very close to the end of times. But that, generally speaking, I think that encourages us to do good and do the best that we can for the Muslim Ummah. But no one should tell you that again that this is so near, so you should act in a certain way very urgently. I think you should generally act good and good for the Muslim Ummah. I think that's my general advice. But I think to say that this is when this would happen, I think anyone who says that is wrong. I think no one can predict when this would happen, the coming of the Mahdi or the coming of the Dajjal. No one can predict that. But of course, acting for the best, for the good of people, for the good of the Ummah, I think that would be the advice. Um, I think also it is true that a lot is being shaped by, for example, Messianic Jews in Israel as well. And some of that also is true of the sort of messianic people in the U.S. as well. So I think this is a widespread thing that is affecting a lot of politics in important places. Although not all of them might have these beliefs, but of course it's affecting a lot of politics in important places. So one should be able to understand and react to the actions that come from these beliefs. But again, I think, yeah, as I just said.
No, Jazakumullah khair. I really appreciate that insight. Again, it's it is really balanced. People are working towards making this a reality, so we need to be wary of that and be wise about the decisions that we make. But at the same time, we don't speak on behalf of Allah and His Messenger, and with a level of certainty that isn't befitting. We don't go to that to that extreme. Junaid, do you have any follow up questions, or what do you think? When is the Mahdi coming?
When is the Mahdi coming? No. Uh, Maybe it was that Sudanese guy, and we all just didn't take him seriously enough.
For
No. Well, all we can say is Allah.
Allah Alam.
I tend to be more skeptical of Mahdi claims. I try to be epistemologically conservative.
Yeah.
But I think I would just round it out. Maybe we'll say thank you to Dr. Mujtaba. Thank you, Dr. Isani. Thank you so much for joining us. Very enlightening conversation. We covered a lot of ground, but your work covers a lot of ground. So I think it was fit to task. And yeah, it was an
Yeah,
closing
no, may
thought.
Allah Azza wa Jal give you tawfiq.
And I would also like to thank you a lot because I think I usually don't talk about my academic articles in these podcasts because people are more concerned with sort of contemporary policy stuff than what has been researched. So I'm thankful that we discussed some academia today as well.
No, alhamdulillah. I think that's what we want to kind of like. We want to invest and build around things that often go ignored, but really do impact, the things that come out on the other end, the policies and so on, because it forms in the minds of people, right? And it's first through the chambers of academia that it rolls, and then from there it goes beyond that. So we want to understand at the higher level, what's developing, and then how it connects to what we then consume in the media and the news and so on and so forth. And mashallah, your work is quite unique in that regard. You work both within the academy and objective analysis in politics and governance, and at the same time you're also kind of a quiet activist working to make institutional changes within the regions and the conflicts that you've worked on. May Allah bless you and give you tawfiq and continue to utilize you for the sake of this ummah. May Allah Azza wa Jal also give you more and more influence and impact in the with the ummah and with its governance and with its thought leaders to be able to affect positive change for us going in the future. Jazakumullah khairan once again, and hopefully inshallah we'll speak again at some point in the future. You'll definitely have more publications and you'll have more like contributions, and we're going to catch up with that inshallah.
Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.